So here's what you need to understand about 500,000 years ago. The world was absolutely brutal. And I mean that in the most literal sense possible. Sheets of ice 2 miles thick were crushing everything in their path across northern lands, and frozen winds howled through valleys where our earliest human ancestors were just trying to make it through another day. Picture this. Temperatures plunging to -40 degrees Fahrenheit during the worst glacial periods, and small bands of early humans huddled in caves scattered from Dragon Bone Hill in ancient China all the way to the limestone shelters of southern France. Now, we need to talk about the women of these groups, because they became something extraordinary during this period. They became humanity's first thermal engineers, and they didn't do this through some grand plan or divine inspiration. No, they figured it out through desperate trial and deadly error, learning that the difference between a shallow cave, sitting at -20 degrees, and a deep chamber that held steady at 40 degrees meant their children would either live or die. That's the math that mattered back then. The story really begins with one particular woman, a matriarch of a band living in what would eventually become Spain. She was the first to notice something interesting. Certain stones along the cave walls stayed warm long after the sun had set. Think about what that observation meant. While everyone else was just trying to survive the night, she was studying the cave itself, looking for patterns, searching for anything that might give her people an edge. And she found it. She started teaching her daughters to gather these thermal stones during daylight hours, placing them carefully in leather pouches near sleeping infants through the frozen nights. It seems simple now, but this was revolutionary. This one innovation, this single act of observation and application, began spreading across entire continents as different groups met at seasonal gathering points. And here's the thing that really gets me. They were trading this knowledge as if it were more valuable than any tool or weapon. Because it was. A stone axe might help you hunt, but thermal stones would keep your baby alive through winter. Let me tell you about one group's desperate winter that changed everything. Their usual cave, the one they'd used for generations, was occupied when they arrived. Cave bears had moved in, and there was simply no way to dislodge them. So they had to make do with a less ideal shelter, and that forced them to innovate rapidly. They discovered something remarkable. Digging sleeping pits into the clay cave floors and lining them with dried grass created insulation that could maintain body heat for hours. The earth itself became their blanket. By 400,000 years ago, something fascinating had developed. Caves like Qasim in present-day Israel show evidence of sophisticated spatial organization that would make a modern architect nod in appreciation. These weren't just random sleeping spots anymore. Different areas were designated for different thermal zones, and people understood exactly why each space worked the way it did. The warmest spots became sacred, and when I say sacred, I mean it in the most practical sense. These were typically 30 to 50 feet from the entrance, positioned where cold air couldn't reach, but smoke from occasional natural fires could escape. These prime real estate locations were reserved exclusively for pregnant women and newborns. This wasn't about status or hierarchy in the way we think about it today. This was about survival mathematics. A pregnant woman or newborn dying meant the group got smaller and weaker. Keeping them alive meant the group continued. These early humans were learning constantly, building a knowledge base that would sustain their species. They learned that caves with southern exposure gathered more heat during winter days. They discovered that limestone chambers held warmth better than granite. They figured out that underground streams, while providing fresh water, created deadly cold drafts that had to be blocked using walls made of stacked stones and mud. Think about what this represents. These were people without writing, without formal education systems, without any of the knowledge transmission methods we take for granted. Yet they were conducting what amounted to systematic experiments in thermodynamics. They were testing materials, observing results, and passing along what worked to the next generation. The thermal stones that started it all evolved into something more sophisticated. Groups learned to heat multiple stones to different temperatures and arrange them in specific patterns around sleeping areas. Some served as long-burning radiators, releasing heat slowly through the night. Others were used for rapid warming when someone was in danger of hypothermia. The largest stones became communal heat sources, positioned centrally where everyone could benefit. Cave selection itself became a refined science. Groups would arrive at potential winter shelters months in advance, spending days testing different areas within the cave system. They'd sleep in various spots, track temperature changes throughout day and night cycles, check for drafts and moisture problems, and assess the structural integrity of the ceiling. The wrong choice meant death, so they took their time making these decisions. And here's something that really illustrates the sophistication involved. They understood microclimates within cave systems. They knew that a chamber deeper in the cave complex might be warmer, but harder to defend. They recognized that height mattered, with warm air rising to create temperature variations of 10 degrees or more between floor and ceiling level. They learned to read limestone formations, knowing that certain patterns indicated stable temperature chambers, while others suggested dangerous cold spots. The insulation techniques grew more complex. Early groups simply piled animal furs on the ground, but by 400,000 years ago, they were creating layered systems. Dried grass formed the bottom layer, providing air pockets that trapped heat. Animal hides went on top, with the fur side facing up to create maximum warmth. Some groups even discovered that certain types of moss, when dried and fluffed, provided better insulation than anything else available. But perhaps the most important innovation was social, because staying warm in -40-degree temperatures wasn't just about technology or cave selection, it was about cooperation. Families learned to sleep in tight groups, sharing body heat through the night. They developed rotation systems so that everyone spent time in both the warm center and the colder edges. They established watch schedules that balanced security needs with heat conservation. These weren't random decisions, made in the moment. These were carefully developed protocols, passed down through generations of hard-won experience. Every protocol had been written in blood, learned through the deaths of those who didn't follow the rules or tried shortcuts that failed. The matriarch who first noticed those warm stones probably never imagined that her simple observation would spark a revolution in human survival. But that's exactly what happened. Her daughters taught their daughters, who taught their daughters, creating chains of knowledge that stretched across millennia. And in the end, that knowledge, that understanding of heat and cold and survival in the harshest conditions imaginable, kept our species alive through Earth's longest winter. 300,000 years ago, the Ice Age still had Earth in its grip. The glaciers hadn't retreated, the temperatures hadn't warmed, and every winter still meant life or death decisions. But something remarkable had happened to human societies during those 200,000 years. They had evolved complex social structures centered entirely around one thing: heat conservation. Let me take you to the Arago Cave in southern France, where 25 individuals developed what I think of as humanity's first experiment in radical equality. They created a synchronized sleeping system that required absolute cooperation. Every 2 hours through the night, people rotated positions. Everyone, and I mean everyone, spent equal time in the warm center of the group huddle and equal time on the cooler edges. No exceptions. Think about what this means. This wasn't kinship determining who stayed warm. This wasn't strength or hunting ability or any other traditional measure of status. This was what we might call thermal democracy, and it created bonds that were actually stronger than family ties. Because survival depended on absolute trust that each person would take their turn on the cold periphery. If someone cheated, if they tried to stay in the warm center too long, people died, so they didn't cheat. Now, during this same period, a new role emerged in human society that would shape everything that came after: the knowledge keepers. And here's what's fascinating. They were almost exclusively elderly women. These were women who could read subtle air currents in caves like you or I might read a book. They knew that a faint breeze from deep in a cave meant there was a hidden exit somewhere, stealing precious heat. They remembered which caves had killed groups through carbon monoxide buildup from poor ventilation. They carried in their minds a map of every thermal shelter within 100 miles, and the specific dangers each one presented. These wise women became living libraries. But they couldn't just store information. They had to transmit it. So they developed elaborate storytelling sessions that served triple duty. And this is where you can see the genius of early human culture. First, these stories entertained people during those long, dark nights when there was nothing else to do. Second, they kept people awake enough to maintain optimal heating positions, because falling into deep sleep in the wrong position could mean freezing to death. And third, most importantly, they transmitted crucial survival information wrapped in narrative that people would remember. One story appeared in variations across caves from Africa to Europe, and we can still trace its basic structure in archaeological evidence. It was the tale of the fire thief, who stole warmth from the sun itself and hid it in special stones for humans to find. Sound familiar? This was the story of thermal stones, the innovation we talked about in the last chapter, but transformed into myth. A child hearing this story would grow up knowing to look for stones that held heat, and they'd remember it because they'd heard the fire thief's adventure dozens of times. But let me tell you about something even more remarkable that developed during this period. The thermal families. These were groups of up to 8 individuals who weren't related by blood at all. They bonded through winters of shared body heat, and those bonds became unbreakable. After surviving a winter pressed against someone, rotating positions through frozen nights, trusting them with your life every single evening, you became family in a way that transcended genetics. And here's what archaeologists can still identify today. These thermal families developed their own heating signatures. Some groups preferred dense fur and grass mattresses, packing the materials so tightly that they created almost no air gaps. Others created elaborate stone heat retention systems, heating dozens of stones during the day and arranging them in specific geometric patterns that we can still see in the archaeological record. Still others specialized in sealing cave entrances, developing sophisticated barriers made from leather stretched over wooden frames, with multiple layers creating dead air spaces for insulation. These different approaches meant that caves became like fingerprints. When archaeologists excavate a site, they can often tell which thermal family lived there based on the heating technology they left behind. It's like each group had their own engineering philosophy, their own approach to the fundamental problem of not freezing to death. Competition for the best wintering caves became intense, and by intense, I mean violent. Evidence from Kebara Cave shows that groups would travel over 100 miles to secure proven thermal shelters. 100 miles in Ice Age conditions, on foot, carrying everything they owned. And once they got there, they would defend these caves with their lives, because a good cave meant survival. A bad cave meant watching your children die. The territorial conflicts that emerged from this competition marked a dark turning point in human behavior. Groups developed recognition systems, ways of marking their conflict caves to show ownership. They posted guards during the warming months to prevent other groups from claiming their winter shelters. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these confrontations turned deadly, with remains showing trauma consistent with territorial defense. But not all discoveries came from conflict. By 250,000 years ago, some groups had found something that changed everything for them: geothermal vents and hot springs. Imagine being one of these early humans, struggling through another brutal winter and stumbling across a place where warm water bubbled up from the earth itself. It must have seemed like literal magic. These discoveries triggered migrations of thousands of miles. Groups would abandon traditional territories and travel enormous distances to secure access to these precious heat sources, and once they found them, they stayed. One remarkable site in what is now Hungary shows continuous occupation for over 50,000 years near Thermal Springs. 50,000 years. That's longer than recorded human history. Generation after generation after generation of mothers teaching daughters the sacred knowledge of the warm waters. The social structures around these geothermal sites became incredibly complex. Because these locations could support larger populations, groups grew from 25 individuals to 50 or even 75. This required new organizational systems. The thermal rotation that worked for a small group became impossible at larger scales. So they developed zones, with different areas around the hot springs designated for different purposes and different age groups. The knowledge keepers at these sites became even more important. They had to track not just which caves were safe, but which areas around the hot springs were too hot, which were just right, and which were prone to dangerous sulfur emissions. They had to manage disputes between families competing for the best spots. They had to maintain the oral history of the springs, ensuring that crucial safety information passed to each new generation. And they had to teach something else: sustainability. Because these geothermal sites, while seemingly inexhaustible, could be damaged by overuse. If too many people crowded too close, if groups built barriers that redirected the water flow, if they disturbed the geological formations that channeled the heat, they could ruin the very resource that kept them alive. The knowledge keepers developed rules, passed down as sacred law, about how to use the springs without destroying them. The social heating systems of this era, whether around hot springs or in traditional caves, resembled complex choreography. Every person had a role. Every role was essential, and every role required trust in everyone else. The pregnant woman in the center trusted the adolescent on the outer edge to do their duty. The adolescent trusted the knowledge keeper to teach them correctly. The knowledge keeper trusted the hunters to bring back materials for better insulation. It all connected. This period, from 300,000 to 250,000 years ago, represents something profound in human history. It's when we stopped being just another species trying to survive and became something else. We became a species that survived through social complexity, through transmitted knowledge, through bonds that transcended blood and created new forms of family. The ice still ruled the earth, but we had learned to rule the ice. Between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Cavewomen reached a level of sophistication in their heating strategies that would seem impossible without fire. I'm talking about creating living conditions in environments so hostile that modern humans with all our technology would struggle to survive there. Let me take you to Denisova Cave in Siberia's Altai Mountains, where winter temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. -50. That's cold enough that exposed skin freezes in minutes, where breathing hurts your lungs, where metal would shatter if you had any. And yet, people lived there. Not just survived, but actually lived, raised families, and thrived. Here's what makes Denisova Cave absolutely fascinating from a scientific perspective. 3 different human species used it. Denisovans, Neanderthals, and early Homo sapiens all occupied this cave at various times, sometimes even overlapping. And each species developed distinct but equally effective heating technologies. It's like a natural experiment in human ingenuity, with 3 different groups solving the same problem in 3 different ways. The Neanderthals, with their stocky builds and enhanced cold adaptation, created something that still impresses modern engineers. They built sleeping chambers using mammoth bones as frameworks, then covered these structures with multiple layers of horse and reindeer hides. The result? Insulation comparable to modern sleeping bags. I'm not exaggerating. Scientists have tested reconstructions of these shelters, and the thermal efficiency is remarkable. Inside one of these chambers, body heat alone could maintain temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the outside air. Early Homo sapiens took a completely different approach, and it reveals something important about how we think as a species. They developed modular heating systems that could be quickly assembled in any cave. Portability was the key. They created windbreaks from willow branches and animal skins that could be rolled up and carried. They designed nested sleeping arrangements where body heat from inner sleepers warmed outer guardians in a carefully calculated thermal cascade. And they discovered something brilliant. Placing heated stones in water-filled bladders created primitive radiators that released warmth slowly through the night. Think about that last innovation for a moment. They figured out that water holds heat longer than stone alone, and that containing hot water in an animal bladder created a safe, long-lasting heat source. That's not just survival instinct. That's physics. That's engineering. That's the kind of thinking that eventually puts humans on the moon. One innovation that spread rapidly across different human populations was what we call the breathing cave technique. Early groups who sealed their shelters too tightly discovered, tragically, that you could suffocate in your sleep. Carbon dioxide builds up, oxygen levels drop, and people simply don't wake up. Once groups figured this out, they developed carefully placed air holes that allowed fresh air in while preserving heat. The placement had to be precise. Too large and you lose all your warmth. Too small and you risk suffocation. In the wrong position and you create drafts that make everything worse. Now, the social heating systems of this era resembled complex choreography, and I want you to really picture this because it's remarkable. Groups of 15 to 30 individuals would arrange themselves in specific patterns based on age, health, and social status. But this wasn't arbitrary status. This was functional organization based on thermal needs. Pregnant women occupied the stable temperature center. Around them, nursing mothers and infants formed the next ring. Then older children, who could tolerate slightly cooler temperatures and whose body heat helped insulate the core. Adolescents formed the outer heat barrier, their young, vigorous metabolisms producing warmth that protected everyone inside. And adults? They rotated through guard duties, using vigorous movement exercises every hour to maintain body temperature while watching for predators. These exercises are actually preserved in rock art from this period. You can see repeated human figures in motion, doing what looks like jumping jacks, knee bends, and arm swings. These might represent humanity's first formal calisthenics routines. They weren't exercising for fitness or fun, they were exercising to stay alive. Women of this period also discovered that certain activities generated communal heat while serving other purposes. This is the kind of multi-purpose thinking that characterizes the best human innovation. Group singing and rhythmic swaying raised collective body temperature while reinforcing social bonds. The songs had multiple verses, complex rhythms, and called for full-body movement. Archaeological evidence suggests these singing sessions could last for hours, keeping people warm and awake during the coldest parts of winter nights. The preparation of hides through repeated scraping and stretching warmed workers while creating tomorrow's insulation. Think about the efficiency here. You're cold, so you work on hides. Working warms you up. The finished hide becomes insulation that keeps you warm later. It's a perfect cycle. Even the grinding of nuts and seeds on stone surfaces generated friction heat that warmed hands and raised ambient cave temperature slightly but measurably. The spatial organization within caves reached remarkable sophistication. Different areas served different functions, and everyone knew the thermal map of their shelter intimately. The deepest chambers, if they maintained stable temperatures, became food storage areas where frozen meat would keep for months. Mid-level chambers served as living and sleeping quarters. Areas near entrances became tool-making workshops where some cold was acceptable because the work generated body heat. Some groups carved modifications directly into cave walls to improve heating efficiency. They created heat-reflecting alcoves, angled surfaces that bounced warmth from heated stones back toward sleeping areas. They built raised sleeping platforms that captured rising warm air, elevating sleepers 2 or 3 feet off the cold ground. The temperature difference between ground level, platform height could be 10 degrees or more. That's the difference between comfort and misery during a long winter night. Ventilation systems became increasingly sophisticated. Groups learned to create chimney effects, where cold air entered through low openings and exited through high openings, creating circulation that refreshed the air without creating drafts in sleeping areas. Some caves show evidence of constructed air channels, tunnels deliberately dug to manage airflow. This required understanding air pressure, temperature differentials, and fluid dynamics, even if they didn't have words for these concepts. The knowledge required to master these systems was extensive. A woman coming of age during this period had to learn the thermal properties of dozens of different materials, the architectural principles of heat retention, the social protocols of communal sleeping, the exercises that generated maximum warmth, the signs of hypothermia in adults and children, the techniques for reviving someone who'd gotten too cold, and the stories that contained all the crucial survival information accumulated by previous generations. This knowledge was tested constantly. A mistake could kill. Choosing the wrong cave meant death. Building inadequate insulation meant death. Failing to maintain proper watch rotation meant death from predators or cold. The margin for error was 0, so the learning had to be perfect. Knowledge keepers drilled young people relentlessly, using repetition, storytelling, and practical exercises to ensure that critical information became automatic. By 50,000 years ago, some human groups had achieved something remarkable. They had developed non-fire heating to near perfection. They could maintain survival in environments that should have been impossible without flame. They had become true masters of the winter darkness, and that mastery would carry our species through the final and most challenging phase of the Ice Age. 50,000 years ago marked the beginning of humanity's most profound technological revolution. But here's what most people don't realize. The transition from pure thermal management to fire mastery took 10,000 years to complete. 10,000 years. That's not a revolution in the way we usually think about it. That's a slow, careful, sometimes reluctant transformation that happened differently in different places, and for very good reasons. During this remarkable period, some groups developed non-fire heating to near perfection, while others experimented with controlled flame. It created a natural experiment in human adaptation, and we can see the results in caves all across the inhabited world. In caves along the Mediterranean coast, traditional heating masters modified cave structures with remarkable engineering that still impresses us today. They carved heat-reflecting alcoves directly into limestone walls, creating surfaces that bounced warmth back toward living areas with measurable efficiency. They built raised sleeping platforms that captured rising warm air, sometimes constructing elaborate wooden frameworks that elevated entire families 3 feet off the ground. They created ventilation systems that pulled cold air out while preserving heat, using principles of thermodynamics that wouldn't be formally described for another 49,000 years. The most sophisticated non-fire practitioners lived in what is now Israel and Jordan, and they developed a technique that archaeologists call solar charging. The name doesn't do it justice. What they actually did was position large flat stones outside their caves to absorb maximum sunlight throughout the day. They studied sun angles, seasonal variations, and optimal stone placement with the precision of modern solar engineers. Then, using wooden carriers they designed specifically for this purpose, they transported these heated stones inside, creating thermal batteries that released heat for up to 6 hours. Let me put this in perspective. These groups could maintain cave temperatures 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside air without burning a single piece of wood. 20 degrees. That's the difference between -10 and +10, between dangerous, cold, and tolerable conditions. And they did it with nothing but rocks, sunlight, and accumulated knowledge. Their understanding of insulation reached extraordinary levels. Early groups had simply piled animal furs on the ground and called it good enough. But by this period, they had discovered something that modern engineers would recognize immediately. Layering different materials creates superior insulation compared to thick layers of a single material. They built up systems with dried grass forming the bottom layer, providing air pockets that trapped heat. Animal hides went on top, fur side up for maximum warmth. Then leather barriers on the sides. Some groups even discovered that certain types of moss, when dried and fluffed properly, provided better insulation than anything else available. We're talking about R-values that wouldn't be matched by human-made materials until the Industrial Revolution. Meanwhile, early fire adopters faced unexpected challenges. And this is important because it explains why fire didn't spread instantly. Fire attracted predators. Large carnivores learned that fire meant humans, and humans meant potential food or at least scavenging opportunities. The light from flames could be seen for miles, revealing locations to enemies. Smoke rose into the sky like a signal flare, broadcasting your position to any rival group within visual range. And then there was the constant fuel gathering. Maintaining fire required enormous amounts of wood, especially in cold climates where fires had to burn continuously. Groups had to send people out into the cold and danger to gather fuel, exposing them to hypothermia, predators, and hostile encounters. For groups that had perfected non-fire heating, this seemed like a terrible trade-off. So many groups developed hybrid systems, and this is where you can really see human adaptability at work. They used fire only for specific purposes, cooking certain foods that were indigestible raw, hardening wooden spear points, or occasionally warming severely hypothermic individuals. But their primary survival strategy remained traditional heating methods. They weren't rejecting fire out of ignorance or stubbornness. They were making rational calculations about risk and benefit. This parallel development created a rich exchange of ideas that benefited everyone. Fire users learned precision heat management from traditionalists. If you can keep people alive using only body heat and thermal stones, you understand heat distribution at a level that fire users needed to learn. Traditional groups, in turn, adopted flame-inspired innovations like concentrated heat sources in specific areas and smoke hole ventilation that improved air quality even in non-fire caves. Trade networks during this period show groups exchanging not just goods but knowledge. A traditional heating expert might visit a fire-using group, observe their techniques, and bring back ideas that could be adapted without flame. A fire user might learn traditional insulation methods that reduced their fuel needs. This cross-pollination accelerated innovation on both sides. But eventually, fire won, not because it was obviously superior, but because it enabled things that traditional heating simply couldn't match. Fire allowed humans to expand into territories that would have been impossible otherwise. Fire enabled new food processing techniques that improved nutrition. Fire created social gathering spaces that fostered larger group sizes and more complex social structures. The advantages accumulated slowly but inevitably. Yet the legacy of 500,000 years of non-fire heating expertise didn't disappear. It couldn't disappear because it had become woven into the very fabric of human behavior and society. The social cooperation required for thermal survival became the template for all human collaborative endeavors. Think about it. The absolute trust needed for thermal rotation, the knowledge transmission from elders to youth, the complex choreography of group sleeping arrangements. All of this created patterns of cooperation that humans still use today. The spatial organization of caves based on heat zones influenced the design of the first permanent dwellings. When humans started building structures instead of just occupying natural caves, they organized interior spaces using the same thermal logic developed over hundreds of thousands of years. Warm centers for vulnerable individuals, cooler peripheries for the strong, careful attention to ventilation and insulation. Medieval castles, modern homes, even space stations use organizational principles that trace back to Ice Age caves. The concept of thermal territory evolved directly into property rights. The fierce defense of winter caves became the defense of land, then homes, then nations. The knowledge-keeping role of elder women established the precedent for specialized expertise and education. Every teacher, every expert, every mentor traces their role back to those wise women reading air currents in limestone chambers. Even today, when humans gather around campfires or huddle together for warmth, we unconsciously recreate the social patterns developed by cavewomen who saved our species through Earth's longest winter. Watch people around a campfire sometime. They arrange themselves in rings. They rotate positions. They share the warmth equitably. They tell stories. All of this, every bit of it, comes from those hundreds of thousands of years of hard-won experience. Modern survival experts studying indigenous Arctic peoples find techniques identical to those developed 500,000 years ago. The layered insulation, the communal, sleeping arrangements, the careful attention to ventilation, the use of thermal stones. These techniques survived because they represent something profound, optimal solutions to fundamental problems. And optimal solutions don't change just because time passes. The greatest innovations endure not because they're sophisticated or complicated, they endure because they work. The cavewomen who developed these heating technologies weren't trying to be innovative, they were trying to keep their children alive. But in doing so, they created the foundation for everything that came after. Every human achievement, every civilization, every technological marvel we've ever created traces back to those desperate winters when women figured out how to make warmth from nothing but knowledge, cooperation, and determination. That's the real story of fire. Not that humans discovered flame, but that humans survived long enough to discover it.